Baylan Skoll is the latest epic confrontation in Galaxy of Heroes, and he's rather a good unit. So let's ask ourselves the question, when is Baylan Skoll coming back, and should you be farming him? Let's break it down. Baylan Skoll, the character that was so perfectly portrayed by Ray Stevenson, rest in peace, good sir, that featured in the Ahsoka series not so long ago. This guy came into the holotables at the end of October. I want to say it was Halloween, in fact, and it was probably one of the dullest events CG has ever released, but don't let that stop you from trying to unlock characters such as Baylan Skoll, because he is, in fact, pretty fantastic. He is a really strong unit, and please ignore the modding on this guy. I have some very strange modding setups on my roster because apparently I'm just a terrible person. I'm a terrible individual, even though he is rocking Relic 9 and triple Omicrons and all that business. He is very good. So, first and foremost, when is Baylan Skoll coming back and his mercenary allies? Well, we don't know yet. There has been no official confirmation. The word on the street is that as an epic confrontation, he should be coming into rotation as a standard sort of rotation for legendary characters every 3 months. So if we're thinking at the end of October that it was going to originally be, then we can ascertain from that maybe at the end of this month or start of February, maybe a couple of weeks into February, that Baylan Skoll's event will return. With that being said, what are the actual requirements for Baylan Skoll? Well, they're not particularly easy and straightforward. They do require almost exclusively relatively new marquee characters. The good thing about this is all of these characters are in fact farmable at this point, so you can easily get the shards without having to spend money on things like chromium packs or even getting him from shipments at 80 crystals per shard at a cost. So who do we need? We need Shin Hati or Shin Hati, we need Marok, we need the Great Mothers, Morgan Elsbeth, and then Grand Admiral Thrawn. All of these characters are required at Relic 7, which is kind of what we should probably expect to be the standard for epic confrontation and legendary events in general. Galactic Legends obviously have a higher tier of requirements to come in, even though GL Ahsoka Tano is perhaps not the most dominant force in the game and requires a lot of Relic 9 characters. So ask yourself this question. Are you going to be the kind of person that wants to get Baylan Skoll? I would say, for the most part, that people can probably afford to leave off on Baylan Skoll just in general, at least until the marquees are accelerated. However, there is one big caveat to that, and that is because some of his requirements are actually fantastic and potentially even better than Baylan Skoll himself. I am, of course, talking about the Great Mothers, and by extension, Morgan Elsbeth. Now, the Great Mothers are an absolutely phenomenal, borderline broken team, in my opinion. Way too strong for a standard marquee, even though they called it an elite marquee, which is just nonsense. Let's be honest, it's just a way of saying we wanted to make this character a legendary unit, but we didn't have time to make a legendary event for her, so we just gave a ridiculously overpowered marquee unit to everybody. Anyway, she is farmable, and the good news is she is farmable from Cantina nodes, which means her shard farm will actually be relatively quick compared to, say, a hard node farm, and the rest of her team is actually very easily accessible because it requires old Night Sister units such as Asajj Ventress or such as Acolyte and that sort of thing. Now, of course, you can put it in with the Peridia Patrol zombies, and that is actually a very good way of doing things, but that ties more into the GL Ahsoka Tano farms, doubles up with a little bit of assault battle goodness, but overall not 100% necessary. When we look at the Great Mothers, defensively speaking in GAC, we can see in the last season they had a pretty solid hold ratio, around a 40% hold ratio. If I actually change this over and look at hold percentiles over here, we can see through insights that they've got nearly a 40% hold ratio, which is absolutely phenomenal. Now, with that being said, that was during the time in which they had a Night Sister Datacron, and in fact many people would have had the Great Mothers Datacron themselves, but even without it, it's still a pretty strong and capable team. Even if you take it offensively speaking, there are a number of teams that they are very powerful against. Gungans, for example, get absolutely melted by the Great Mothers because you remove all their protection, and they have no real health to speak of. The point I'm trying to make is, even if you don't want to push all the way for Baylan Skoll, which I do think is still a good investment for most people, the Great Mothers, at the very least, are 100% worth the investment. These guys still cause such problems on defense, and I really do truly believe that this is a team that will also continue to perform very, very well as new Datacron sets come out. I don't even think that they need a Night Sister Datacron. I think if we've got things like a 15% bulk TM Cron or a 25% turn meter Cron, then they're still going to perform very, very well. They still require some pretty heavy teams to counter when they're on defense, even after they've lost their incredibly powerful Night Sister Datacron. And one thing worth mentioning when it comes to the Night Sisters as well is that in Rise of the Empire TB, on the Dathomir planet, there is a special mission that requires a full team of Relic 7 Night Sisters to complete, and the Great Mothers absolutely trivialize that special mission and make it an absolute guaranteed bona fide win for you. I'll have a video guide on that very, very shortly. I think we've got just a couple of days until that planet opens for us, and I'll get that video out as quickly as I possibly can in case you guys are interested. Now, when it comes to whether or not I recommend people go for Baylan Skoll right now or not, really comes down to that little bit of uncertainty. I do think he's a valuable GL, and he can beat things like JMK and Rey and Leia, which is really, really obviously very valuable. The problem is some of that information that we've got currently about how well he performs is being overshadowed or obfuscated a little bit by the fact that he does have a dedicated Datacron active at this point. What happens when that Datacron disappears? How viable is he afterwards? I'm not even sure, I'm sorry to say. However, there is another thing to take into consideration of we don't actually have a guaranteed date for when he's going to be coming back, and after that, his third appearance, we don't have a guaranteed date that he's going to be coming back in 3 months. CG have frequently said that these months come back every 3 months. These events come back every 3 months, apologies, but what happens in practice doesn't always follow that timeline. Sometimes they come back in 3 months, and sometimes they end up like Jedi Knight Cal Kestis and they disappear for 6 to 8 months, like Grand Inquisitor as well, just disappears off the face of the planet for an extended period of time. And if you want to run the risk of not getting that character within that first 3 month time frame, who knows how long we are actually going to be waiting. So it creates this level of uncertainty that makes things very, very difficult to really guarantee when he's going to come back and when you should start farming. Now you could take the very safe route and say, how about I just farm all the shards for all the marquee characters, get them up to 7 stars, but don't necessarily invest any resources until we know the Baylan Skoll event is coming back, and that would be a pretty safe bet, provided you are not, impacting other farms and requirements that you might be trying to get in the meantime. Say you're working towards, I don't know, Jabba the Hutt, for example. Another thing I would say is characters like Jabba the Hutt are probably a better investment overall than characters like Baylan Skoll. We can see that Baylan Skoll over here does a fantastic job against Rey in 3v3s, and that's always a good positive thing to have. Now, like I said, this is including a dedicated level 9 Datacron that actually works directly for Baylan Skoll, so it's not going to be indicative of how he will perform without it, but he can still do some very, very solid work, and overall, a pretty fun team. Now, if we think about the other characters that we actually use, the main characters that we use for Baylan Skoll, I'm talking about Shin and Marok, they bring their own level of sauce to the team as well. Shin Hati, for example, actually makes a very good plug-and-play character to go in unaligned Force user teams. In a 5v5 scenario, you can throw her in with the Seer Malakos team, and she does a lot of work at building up additional stacks of that Edge of Madness that Malakos gets. She also has significant levels of damage on her AoE and her kick, so she's actually going to be great before you actually get Baylan Skoll unlocked. Similar things can be said about Marok. He does have the Inquisitorius tag, so if you are a person that does have Grand Inquisitor or Reaver, he does actually feature very, very well in those teams as well. He is also an unaligned Force user, so you can throw him in with teams like Slacker, or you can throw him in with Lord Vader, and he still will do some pretty good work. Alternatively, you can use him as a dark side unaligned Force user for things like Starkiller if you're looking to do some funky lineups. There's also a very good Omicron on this guy for TB. Now, I don't personally invest in territory battle Omicrons, but the option is available to you if you want to make TB battles and special missions much, much easier. This guy turns the Reaver mission into an absolute full auto cakewalk, so if you really do want to get those Reaver shards and you want to guarantee it across your guild, this Omicron will sort you out. Outside of the characters that are mandatory for the Baylan Skoll unlocked, most people will be using characters like Hondo with their Baylan Skoll. Now, Hondo himself has had a bit of an up and down sort of life cycle in Galaxy of Heroes. Sometimes he's good, sometimes he's not so good, really depends on the datacrons. But under a Baylan Skoll team, he's actually really, really good. There's lots of scoundrels in that team, and he can, of course, capture an enemy out of the rip. Giving that additional level of control to a Baylan Skoll team really does make it shine. In isolation, Hondo is of course a requirement to unlock, I want to say, Starkiller? No, not Starkiller. It is Aphra, and Aphra is an okay character, not someone I would really go out of my way to unlock. When it comes to epic confrontations, I would highly recommend getting Baylan before Aphra, because that's just the way I feel about it in terms of power levels and return on investment. The last person that people tend to recommend to use with Baylan Skoll is Kira. At least that's what CG recommended to us, and the reason for that is I believe it's her AoE gives all our allies or something like that health steal up, which has a certain amount of synergy when it comes to Marok and it comes to Shin and the additional damage that they can deal under Baylan Skoll. However, unless you've already got it built up for the SM, within territory battles, I wouldn't really go out of my way to invest in Kira. She's not that good of a unit in general. You can always use someone like Canderous Ordo in her place, and he will do just as well. Failing that, just pick a mercenary. Heck, even Boba Fett, Scion of Django, will have his place under a Baylan Skoll team and still do perfectly well. Overall, I will say, tentatively speaking, that the end of this month, start of next month, is most likely when the Baylan Skoll event is coming back. So make that part of your plans when you're thinking about whether or not to go for Baylan Skoll. Personally, I think he is actually a lot of fun and benefits a lot of people, but if you don't want to go for him, at least get the Great Mothers to get a massive performance boost in PvP and PvE game modes. You heard it here first, or maybe you didn't. Anyway, if you could give me a like at the end of this video, I would really appreciate that. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you all in the very next video. Peace out, and may the Force be with you.